Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here with another Master Duel video for you all. So today we're going to be taking another look at the meta, but as opposed to yesterday's video, which was a tier list that was more subjective. It was definitely more based on my opinion of where every deck stood on in the current meta, rather. This time we're going to take a look at data from Master Duel meta. So we're taking a look at data compiled from 311 decks that have been submitted to Master Duel meta from January 10th to January 24th that have reached Diamond rank. So this time around, we're not just looking at Diamond 1 decks, we're once again taking a look at decks that have reached Diamond 5 as well as Diamond 1. Now, I did go through them and make sure to weed out any duplicates, because in the past I haven't always done that, but this time around I was like, I just want to make sure that we're all squared away here, so I decided to go through and kind of again, weed out all those duplicates as I was counting all the Diamond 5 decks. Because Master Duel Meta has a filter where you can look at Diamond 1, but not necessarily Diamond 5 decks. I did notice something kind of interesting. There were like 180 some decks submitted to Diamond 1, but when you look at just Diamond 5, when I manually counted that all up, it was more close to like 120 some decks. So we're already seeing like a lot more decks that people have gotten to the top rank with, as opposed to just the top set of ranks, Diamond. But I feel like Diamond is overall, especially at this point in the meta, like this point in the season, a pretty good representation of what the overall meta is like. So I wanted to make sure that I included the Diamond 5 decks, not just for that reason, but also because that's going to give us a larger figure to work with, and it's going to be closer to a statistic that we're seeing overall, as opposed to like just stuff that's exclusively reaching Diamond 1. Because also you got to figure, at the end of the season, when you derank from Diamond, you're going to go to Plat. No matter whether you're Diamond 1 or 5. So I like to kind of consider the whole rank there as much as possible within the data that we are able to access there. So as always, we're going to actually take a look at the last set of data before taking a look at the most recent set. So we'll just go ahead and click over to the next screen here. That's going to be Diamond 1 decks from December 8th until January 9th. So this is actually what we covered in the last video. I wanted to make sure that we did it around the time of January 10th, because that is, of course, when the latest selection and secret pack updates released. The selection pack brought us, Therion, Libromancer, and Heroic, so those haven't made as much of a splash in the meta, but the secret pack update that updated Mathmechs and Sky Strikers was much more relevant, and we'll see the impact of that here in a moment. But beforehand, before those cards kind of came into the meta and shook things up, we're looking at a case where Sword Soul Tindy had vastly overtaken Branded Despia, which at the time I kind of speculated was maybe Branded Despia slightly falling out of favor. Perhaps it's the Runic matchup, which is a very close third to Branded Despia second. Sword Soul Tindy does tend to have a better Runic matchup, so I was speculating maybe that was the reason we're just seeing more Sword Soul Tindy, or maybe just people getting sick of Branded Despia, not just playing against it, but playing with it too. People are like, I'd rather try a different deck. We did see a rise in Adamantipator as well, as the Duelist Cup showed the deck is still very relevant, so a lot more people tend to play it on the ranked ladder as well. Of course, we also saw around this time that Block Dragon went to 1, so that was another kind of impact on the meta. So again, this is the set from more or less the last season, but just the last month in general. So as opposed to that, let's now take a look at the last 2 weeks here. Now again, remember that we had not only the new decks, but also more majorly, we had updates to Mathmech and Sky Striker. And as we take a look at the Diamond ranked decks from January 10th to 24th, so from the day that these new cards are released until the time I'm recording this, like tonight pretty much, we're seeing a huge upset in the meta. This is a massive difference from what we were seeing before. So Mathmech is coming in at 16.7% of all Diamond ranked decks. That's Diamond 5 and Diamond 1 submitted in that time. 16.7%. Then you have Sword Soul coming in at 10.9% afterward. That is a pretty massive upset to not only be a tier 1 deck in general, but also to so thoroughly dethrone the formerly top tier 1 deck. With a disparity of almost 6%. That's pretty incredible, and honestly, I think we can well account for not just the popularity of a new deck, but also this new deck is pretty powerful. Now, I say Mathmech is a new deck. The deck as a whole is not new, but its introduction into the meta is very new. The only new card that was actually released was one card. It was Mathmech Circular, and before that, we wouldn't even really see Mathmech show up in like the Rogues Gallery. And honestly, even beyond that, you never really saw Mathmech, making any significant, not even significant. Like, I honestly, in all my previous data reports, I couldn't tell you a single time I encountered Mathmech even once. Until Circular came out. Now, granted, Circular itself is a very powerful card. You take just about any archetype would want a card like Circular, but Mathmech in particular, and we'll talk about this in more detail a little bit, but I think Mathmech in particular is very well poised in the current Master Duel meta to have made as big of a splash as it did. I think this does go pretty well beyond like initial release hype. Mathmech is absolutely a tier 1 deck, there's no question about that. And it honestly might just be the best deck in Master Duel right now. Now, I knew when Circular came out that it was going to make a huge impact on the deck, but to be honest, I kind of thought it would make the deck tier 2. I was like, it's probably, I think I even said in a video, like, oh, the deck's probably going to be like tier 2. It'll be a huge upgrade. I definitely didn't expect this, and after playing with the deck, I'm now starting to see, like, the more I play with it, like, more and more, like, oh yeah, no, this is definitely deserved, like, a slot in the top tier 1. So again, we have Sword Soul Tinny coming up behind that at 10.9%, 5.8%, so another huge gap between the next two decks, and the next deck isn't even Branded Despia, it's Sky Striker at 5.8%. Now, to be fair, Branded Despia isn't too far behind at 5.1%, but still, that is by far the lowest percent we've seen Branded Despia be played at pretty much since its release. It's gone even further down from its position in the last meta report that we took a look at. And to see a deck like Sky Striker overtake it is pretty surprising. Now, granted, of course, Sky Striker recently got linkage. It's a huge upgrade to the deck. It's not only a massive boost in consistency, but it also allows the deck to OTK with simply Ray plus linkage. So, of course, we would expect to see, Sky Striker being 5.8% representation. That's actually not particularly surprising to me. What is surprising to me is see Branded Despia go this far down. Now, I've speculated recently that, like, Branded Despia, it's probably not seeing as much play because most people who were playing it are probably either playing Sword Soul and Mathmech, and I do think that's true to an extent, but really, I'm starting to see more and more the more I think about it, and also the more input I get from you all in the comments and other kind of social resources I use online. I'm starting to see more and more that Branded Despia might actually just not be well positioned in the current meta. It already had a hard time with Runic, which we'll talk about Runic in a second, in a bit actually, because it's pretty far down the list here. But it's not only not particularly well positioned against Runic, which is recently very popular, but the more it's played and the more often it's played against, the easier it is to out, the more people recognize like when to use certain negations, how to out certain boards, and honestly, it's not only just, again, the fact that people are kind of used to playing against Branded Despia, but also it is the fact that people are getting a little bit too used to playing with it. So I think a lot of these Mathmech players, and I mean, I'm very much one of them, honestly. I think all these people who are playing Mathmech a lot now maybe might have been people who were playing a lot of Branded Despia in the past. Again, myself being one of them, I can definitely vouch for that. So beyond Branded Despia, we have Flandres still making a pretty nice splash. 3.2% is definitely lower than we've seen it, but given the fact that Mathmech has kind of like wedged itself in as a top deck, I think it's pretty natural that we're going to see other decks as a whole just see fewer representation across the board. Just behind Flandres at 3.2%, we have actually 4 decks at 2.9% each. That's going to be Dragon Link. It's been a pretty consistent mainstay. Not surprised to see it here. Adagnister, also not surprised to see it here. This is the first time we've seen Adagnister like outside of the other category, outside of the Rogues Gallery, but with Mathmech not only hugely supporting its own archetype, it actually inadvertently kind of supports every Cyberse archetype that can afford to play it, which is pretty much all the major relevant ones, mostly Adagnister. So we're seeing that coming at 2.9%. Dinomorphia has actually been a pretty consistent mainstay, even after the release of Rexsturm. This deck might actually have some staying power in a best of one meta with Master Duel. With the Rexsturm being able to negate cards, sometimes in one game you just don't have the hand or the resources in deck to overcome that. So Dinomorphia, I think, much like Mathmech, actually pretty hugely benefits from the not only current meta sphere, but also just the fact that Master Duel Rank Ladder is best of one. After that, we have another new face outside of the other category, just a new name in general to the kind of meta reports here, and that's Sun Avalon. Sun Avalon is, I gotta be honest, a deck I don't know a whole lot about. So, I actually have seen some comments from the tier list video that I did that are saying, why did you leave out Sun Avalon? Honestly, the mostly why I left out Sun Avalon is because, at the time I was recording that video a few days ago, I wasn't really sure why we were seeing a lot of Sun Avalons. It didn't really, make a lot of sense to me. So I decided not to report on it because I didn't want to misspeak about a deck. But then I realized, of course, Therions came out recently, and Therion has their plant boss monster. So much like the Regulus, I think it is, the Omni Negate, the machine one, much like that can just support machine decks in general, we're seeing that the plant Therion monster can then support plant decks in general. And Sun Avalon, which is already like a decent enough deck in its own right, definitely got a nice boost in playability from that. And then coming up in the rear at 2.6, so lower than the last 4 decks, and lower than any other deck we're seeing here, aside from ones in the other category, we have Runic taking up the rear at 2.6%. That was actually really surprising for me to see, because I personally have played against, I feel like, less, but not significantly less number of Runic decks in general. But honestly, we're just not seeing that many reporting reaching Diamond 1, or Diamond in general. Again, this is not just Diamond 1, these are also Diamond 5 decks too. Runic has fallen pretty hard, and it's kind of interesting to think about. There is actually this is actually a case where I do feel like potentially, there is a major discrepancy between what's being reported on Master Duel Meta and what we're actually seeing on ladder. Now, this could easily just be my personal bias, but again, I feel like I've seen more Runic decks than, Sun Avalon or Dinomorphia, or even Adagnister, or definitely Dragon Link. Again, that's just my personal experience, but you do have to consider that these are decks that, these statistics rather, are being pulled from decks that are being actually submitted by people to Master Duel Meta. It could be, I'm not saying this is the case, it could be, potentially, that, people are not really too willing to submit a Runic deck, a Floodgate-based deck to, like, the website, because they just, I don't know, maybe they feel like they're gonna get, like, shit on for it or something. I don't know. But to be fair, I will say, that doesn't really seem to have stopped people who use other meta decks from submitting their decks, so I don't know if that's necessarily a serious factor there. It could also be, because I did notice that some Sky Striker decks that are playing Runic engines kind of got counted as Sky Striker decks. I did try to account for that, but even when I still noticed that Runic definitely took a sharp hit as far as decks being submitted to Master Duel Meta. So, is it a case of Runic players not submitting their decks? Maybe, but I actually think that's less likely to be the case. I think it is more likely that we're just not seeing as many people play Runic. Maybe the Runic, maybe it really was just Runic hype, who knows? Or maybe, I don't know, maybe Floodgates just aren't as good in this meta. We're not seeing Eldritch represented either, so I don't know, it's interesting. Now that I think about it and I'm looking at the actual, spread of decks here, yeah, there's Flaunderies, and, Dinomorphia's got Negate, but, I don't think either of those are necessarily as bad as something that plays, Skill Drain, goes in, there can only be one, all that kind of stuff, because Floodgate, back row based Floodgate, you have to kind of play Feather Duster, or sometimes, not always, but sometimes, some specialized removal for it. A lot of people I know like using Cosmic Cyclone, whereas monster based Floodgate, like Flaunderies, Zempan, Dinomorphia's Rexterm, it's you can just kind of, you don't always open Imperm, but you're usually playing it anyway, so it's you can just kind of Imperm it, or use some other monster removal. Monster removal in general is just easier to come by than back row removal. So yeah, so that's kind of the breakdown as far as I think we have 11 decks here. Well, no, it's 11 counting others, so 10 decks here. These are definitely more of the top decks seen in the meta, but as always as ever, I like to kind of show off what's going on here in the other category as well. So let's go and take a look at that. I like to call this, as I've referenced a couple of times, the Rogues Gallery. So these are the top decks of the other category. And I do have them here in order from top left to bottom right of the most seen as opposed to the least. So Heroes were actually just behind Runic there. Alongside Salamandrate, I believe I had close to the same number of decks there. Salamandrate, makes sense. because much like the Adagnister deck, the arrival of Mathmech Circular has indeed boosted Salamandrate's power as well. Heroes are always at about this part in the Rogues Gallery, but I think maybe more people might be gravitating towards Heroes because I know that in Power of the Elements there's some other hero support. I don't know necessarily how good it'll do for the current hero strategy, but, you know, all the same, I feel like it's any amount of hero support. I mean, I know I'm looking forward to it, so I think a lot of other people who really like heroes are as well. Beyond that, we have ABCs. We haven't seen them like at all, not even the Rogues Gallery before this point, but with the release of Therions and the additional support from that, makes sense. Marine Sis has been a pretty consistent mainstay of about this place in the meta, like tier 3, upper rogue. So I'm not surprised to see it here. Same as the case for Drytron, Labyrinth. We kind of talked about these decks a little bit in the tier list that I made there. Marine Sis, Drytron, Labyrinth, Madolches, Adamantipator actually put a tier 3. We'll talk about that in a minute. But, like, you know, these 4 decks right here, and also Thunder Dragons as well, although I don't think I specifically put Thunder Dragons on the tier list, but yeah, these are all decks that pretty consistently show up at about this stage in the, you know, the meta here. Like, they're upper rogue, they're kind of on the cusp of being tier 3, but not quite there. Labyrinth, as I've mentioned a couple of times, will definitely get better as future support comes out. I would definitely expect that deck to be on the rise. I don't know if it's going to be in the near future. Actually, I'm very confident it won't be in the near future, but at some point in the future, expect Labyrinth to break out of Rogue. But all these other decks, you know, have kind of been here, not just recently, but more or less the entirety of Master Duel. Adamantipator is at about the same level as well. Then, you know, we have Cybers, you know, we've pretty consistently seen alongside, like, Heroes and Madolche and all that stuff. Adamantipator, I did have rated a little bit higher at tier 3 on my personal tier list, but I did also, and I kind of figured this was going to happen, I did also account for the fact that it was going to see a pretty significant drop in play once Block Dragon went to 1. I will maintain that I do think the deck is honestly not that much further at all down from where it was. I think it's probably lower tier 3, honestly, but that's my personal opinion. The data that we see here has it pretty firmly in the other category. Cyber, as I mentioned, Mutant we're probably seeing more of because of the solo mode event, and also because they got the new, like, accessories recently, so that might be a bit of hype from that. But I mean, Mutant's not a bad deck in its own right. It's definitely a very solid one, and it is definitely capable. I mean, obviously, we're seeing here that it's capable of reaching Diamond, but it's interesting that we're seeing more of it. I think it is mostly because of, like, maybe some accessory hype. Agents we're seeing some more of, Synchrons, Earth Machines, these were definitely boosted by Therions, same with Orchist. Orchist was already boosted in its own right, but also some Therion support doesn't help it, or it does help it rather, it's not too bad for it there. Branded Predaplant has definitely taken a pretty sharp decline. It was pretty obvious that was going to be, like, a new deck hype, but still putting up a relatively decent showing within the other category. Tri-Brigade, Pendulum Magician, we got some Dark Magician decks, we had a couple of those. I noticed one was using a Spellbook engine, which I hadn't really seen before, so that was kind of interesting. We got Blackwing's Tunes, got 2 Tune decks, one that reached Diamond 5 and one that reached Diamond 1, and they were actually both different people, so I mean, it just goes to show, right? Like, you know, I so often see people say, like, oh, you can't hit Diamond unless you use a meta deck. You can't hit Diamond unless you use one of, like, 3 good decks. But it's like, it's one of the reasons I really like doing the Rogues Gallery and going into each of these archetypes in general. I really like showing that, hey, you don't actually need to be playing, like, I don't know, I kind of want to, like, prove that mindset wrong, because I don't know, I feel like it creates this kind of toxic mentality on both ends, right? It kind of creates this toxic mentality on, like, the more meta side of things, where it's like, oh, you know, if people aren't playing meta, what are you even doing? It's like, well, no, you know, people can, you know, want to try and get as far up in ranked as they can with their pet decks. There's nothing wrong with that. Similarly, though, I do think that there is an equally toxic mentality of, oh, if you're in the upper rank, it means you used a meta deck. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily the case. Like, there are a lot of people, I'm not one of them, by the way, I'm not saying this is me, but there are a lot of people who are diehard Dark Magician fans who work really hard to get up to Diamond and Diamond 1. So it's like, I don't know, I kind of want to show off their accomplishments as well. Like Tunes, Trap Tricks, Those are decks we don't see too often on ladder at all. So to actually, break through all the other meta decks being played on Diamond and get up to Diamond, even just Diamond in general, but Diamond 1 as well, definitely an accomplishment. Scareclaws is actually one that we had seen in the past be pretty hyped, but has died back down to about the level I kind of expected it to be at. Live Twin, as much as remiss as I am to admit, I really like Live Twin, but this is probably about where I would place it in the meta. Magical Muskets have actually been seeing a decent bit of play ever since Runic came out. Runic definitely helps support that deck, but ultimately, yeah, still pretty firmly in the Rogue category. And these last three are kind of like, well, Heroic is not too surprising because they got new support, but the deck is still pretty firmly garbage, honestly. Metaphys, it's interesting, we've not really seen many Metaphys before, but we're just seeing a couple now. And then the weather got boosted relatively recently, so not terribly surprised to see it here. So, what can we make of all of this information? Here are some notable data trends that I've observed when just looking at all these Master Duel meta decks. First and foremost, it's pretty obvious, the elephant in the room, Mathmech. Mathmech has quickly proven itself to be a tier 1 deck in the current meta, with the ability to set up multiple negates and discards going first, and OTK multiple ways going second. It proves to be especially good in a best of 1 format. So that's kind of what I meant by that. The fact that if you go first, you can set up the super factorial, as well as having the line to go into, at worst, Heat Soul, but usually Appaloosa. And if you have, not even just a good hand, but even, a decent hand, if you open Circular, or a way to get to Circular, plus Diameter, or Addition, or Subtraction, then you can actually use Laplation on turn 1, and just start, discarding multiple cards out of your opponent's hand between the turn 1 Laplation and then the turn 2 Laplation off these super factorial. So you can do that going first, and then, yeah, you can, more often than not, you're going to update Jammer access code OTK if you go second, but if you really want to, you can also do the final Sigma OTK too. So between both of those factors, in a best of 1 format, it's really not hard to see why Mathmech is doing so well, because it really does not care if it goes first or second in a format where it really matters whether you go first or second. Now, to be fair, Mathmech does care. You do prefer to go first, but you're not Mathmech is one of those decks where I'm not really phased when I lose the coin toss. It's just alright, I guess I'm just going to update Jammer access code OTK. It's I just have another, path already set. So I think Mathmech is pretty solid in Master Duel, not only because of that, but also because, when Circular came out in the TCG, it was immediately competing with sprites and tier limits. It doesn't have to do that right now. Circular and Mathmech in general get to be in a format where other decks are honestly reasonably close to their power level, as opposed to, again, the paper formats were released alongside decks that were definitely not well beyond, but a decent step up from its and the current deck's power level. Alright, so aside from Mathmech, talking once again about Branded Despia, Branded Despia has seen a significant decrease in play, enough to be considered a tier 2 deck by most metrics. However, this could be due to a drop in popularity amongst Diamond players, rather than power level. I don't feel like I really need to elaborate too much on this one. I've kind of already made this point, not just in this video, but in other videos as well. As far as what I think of Branded Despia, after seeing these numbers, It's interesting to think that maybe we were over-evaluating Branded Despia, possibly. Or maybe it just is that Mathmech just is a more powerful deck. I don't know, it's something I want to think more about before making a conclusive decision. But it is interesting. I think the phenomenon that's going on with Branded Despia in Master Duel right now is interesting to think about. Speaking of decks that have seen drops in play, as I talked about earlier, Runic. Wow, we're not seeing hardly any Runics compared to what we were seeing. But I mean, if we look, we go back a couple of slides, we were seeing Runic at 8.7% play as the third most popular deck. Runic was the third most popular deck for this whole month. This whole month before the most recent pack came out, Runic was everywhere. And now we're seeing it again at 2.6. 8.7 to 2.6. That is a 6% drop in overall 6%, a 6% drop, if I can use my words. That's huge. So what does that mean? Runic has dropped severely ever since the latest pack release. It's unclear if Floodgate-based Runic will continue to drop in play, but expect the Runic engine to stick around with Sky Strikers and sprites in the future. So, Yeah, I think what's going on here is that, honestly, the Floodgate-based quote-unquote pure Runic deck, it's not a particularly popular deck to play. I mean, God, like literally click any given post in the subreddit and you'll see at some point in the comments like Runic bad. And I'm not saying like, I'm not saying that Floodgate based Runic is necessarily the best deck to have around, although I do think that is more of the Floodgate's problem than Runic's problem. I think Runic is fine. I think having a good mill deck in the meta is fine. I think it's even interesting, honestly. Now, I will say that as I've said before, I do think Skill Drain, there can only be one, and maybe even Goes In and Rivalry should probably go to one. If Goes In and Rivalry don't go to one, maybe Summon Limit should go to two. I do think there do need to be more limits on the current back row based floodgates that we have, but like all in all, I don't think they have a chokehold on the meta, and certainly the data seems to indicate that they don't really have much of a presence in the meta right now at all. Now, again, as I alluded to earlier, that could be less people submitting the deck, and I do think to an extent that is a factor, but if you're applying that factor to all the decks, which you reasonably could, then it kind of becomes a moot point, right? Because, like, there could be people who are like, oh yeah, I hit Diamond 1, but I did it with Sword Souls, or I did it with Mathmech, or I did it with Brain of Despia. Is that even really worth submitting? Like, for every argument you can make that Runic players are thinking that to themselves, you could make it for any other, like, tiered deck. So, and also, lest we forget, Runic was represented in the past, as we saw. It was the third most played deck, so I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon to behold. And the final point that I noticed is more related to Therion, actually. Though Pure Therion sees almost no play. Indeed, I think I've played against a Pure Therion deck exactly one time so far this season. Many Therion cards have boosted other decks' power levels, most notably Sun, Avalon, and ABC. As I mentioned when we were going over those decks, Sun, Avalon, ABC, we didn't see those at all in any previous meta reports, even in like the bottom of the Rogues gallery. But now that Therions are out, it's funny, Therions are kind of, in a way, better for every other deck that can support them than their own, because they kind of give boss monsters to, like, plants, for example. Plants didn't have, like, Sun Avalon didn't really have too many strong monsters to end on, but the plant Therion monster, whose name escapes me completely, actually, at the moment, does actually provide a solid, like, support as far as, like, just a good general big monster for them to have. And then, of course, we're seeing Therion Regulus boost quite a bit of machine decks. Some Sky Strikers are using it. ABC in general was already a relatively decent rogue deck, but with the addition of Therion Regulus has got a pretty solid power boost. Same with Earth Machines, Earth Machines we hadn't seen in the Rogues gallery before, but now we are seeing them here, thanks to the boost that Therion's provided. So Therion's not that great as a whole, but their parts actually doing pretty well. So I think that's about all the kind of points and trends that I wanted to cover as far as the most recent meta report goes. If you have some thoughts about, these figures here, definitely let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And it's interesting to see how we're going to see things pan out in the future moving on from here. Will we see Mathmech continue to hold its position? Will we see Runic continue to slip further down? What about Brain of Despia? Will it kind of get its foothold back in, or is it going to keep going down as well? Only time will tell. But as always as ever, I want to thank you all for joining me here. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page, there for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation, you do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot, as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now, so without further ado, this is XLex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.